right, Isaiah 38. Let's call this one Endurance, in a chapter that I'm going to have to summarize roughly, because it is, one, a relatively famous story, and then two, clearly I'm driving, so I'm not going to be able to look at it and break it down item by item, even though I am generally familiar with the story of Hezekiah after all that he has been through. The previous two chapters describing the way in which he has endured the assault from Assyria, taking over much of the country until God stopped them outside the doors, for lack of a better term, of Jerusalem, defending them at that point. Well, if it wasn't enough for God to bring them that scared, now it's not just a scare, but Hezekiah is going to fall sick, and the prophet Isaiah is going to bring him word that it is no joke. He is actually going to die. Accompanying that with the famous words, set your house in order because you are going to die. And Hezekiah is going to pray to God that after all he has been through and the way in which, especially in contrast to some of the other kings of Judah, he actually turned to God in a time of crisis without having to be provoked, prompted, or dragged by the ear to do so. And it helped actually lead Judah out of a very difficult time. Now, after all of that, this is not the way he wants to go. And so God is going to send Isaiah back to Hezekiah saying, I have heard your prayer. Once again, much like the prayer he offered up in defense of Judah during the Assyrian invasion. And more importantly, at this point, he's going to also notice that he has seen his tears, and he is going to add 15 years to Hezekiah's life. Adding to that a sign, and that sign is going to be the turning back of a sundial. I think it is a sundial called Ahaz's dial. 10 steps, whatever that means. I think it's 10 steps on that dial, as a sign that he is going to save Hezekiah, and I believe also as a sign that he is going to make good on that promise to give him 15 additional years of life. At which point, Hezekiah is going to have a song or a poem commemorating the way in which God actually did make good on that promise and deliver him from the sickness that should have actually led to his death. And three things, I guess, that caught my attention from this chapter were the way that endurance seemed to play a role in, one, his sickness, two, in the sign that God gave him, and then finally in his recovery. First of all, in his sickness. One of the things that came to mind was Hezekiah's perspective. In the number of times that I've gone through this story, I still don't think I have a clear understanding of his point of view. One, because I've never been a king, and then two, even from just a human perspective, I don't necessarily understand what it's like to have endured all of that only to get that kind of news on the heels of what seemed like a deliverance. But I have talked about in past times the way in which, at a point in which I have been delivered from difficult times, I want that deliverance to be prolonged or to last a little bit longer than it sometimes does. I don't want the next bout of bad news to come really on the heels of my deliverance. And so one of the ways, just based on my experience, that endurance might have played a role in his sickness is simply wanting a little bit of time between bouts of bad news, wanting your good times to simply be prolonged just a little bit longer. However, as we said, his appeal to God actually reminds us that God does answer prayers, even if he doesn't always answer them the way that we want. Sometimes it's important enough to remember that unanswered prayers should not discourage us from praying, because we never know when the next prayer in a time of severe difficulty might actually produce the results that we hoped for. And with that, God gave him not only an answer to his prayer, but a sign. Why? Because a man who has been through that kind of difficulty, we don't necessarily know what his perspective might have been like. And if God did not answer the prayer to heal him right away, whether or not he would have gone back into unnecessary despair. Because it is one thing for God to answer a prayer, but it is another thing for him to answer prayer in a way that still leaves us in our misery. And so if we have to wait for a prolonged response in our time of need, we can almost endure a Job-like period of life where things are going to return to normal or even better than normal, but our waiting period is filled with misery. And so when God gives him a sign, He helps his endurance by not necessarily requiring him to endure the period between the good news and the healing with an unnecessary measure of misery. And finally, when he is healed, the song of dedication that I really would need time to go through and break down in detail to give a proper summary. But one of the things that did catch my attention from the song of dedication was the way in which Hezekiah was not holding on to life as a man who had only been through a few trials in life. He reminded me in some ways of a description of Jesus that seems to describe him as a man of sorrows acquainted with grief. Hezekiah, in reflecting on his own trials, seems like they have been many. And even though he seems to be exhausted with the trials that he has seen in life, he does not seem to want to go out, as we mentioned before, this way. And so even though he seems to have been tapped out on his endurance, he still seems to have wanted a better exit from life than the one that he was facing. And so in this chapter, God seems to be gracious, not only in the way that he helps him to recover, but he grants him a recovery that seems to be prolonged in its endurance, meaning he could have only given him another year to say goodbye to his family and get his house in order and come to grips with the fact that he was at some point going to have to pass. But he gave him an additional 15 years of enduring, healing, and life to enjoy. And as we go to the next chapter, we're going to see how those next 15 years will have been spent in some measure of prosperity. And beyond those 15 years, it seems that God was once again gracious in the way that he answered his prayer. Not only promising him healing, but giving him a sign that would leave him encouraged until Hezekiah was restored again.